He didn't ignore the warning signs, because there weren't any. Nothing about that moment suggested risk or danger. Nothing in the way the conversation unfolded or the way the situation presented itself gave Carlos Reeves a reason to hesitate. It felt familiar, grounded in a level of trust that had been built over time. The kind of trust that doesn't come from one interaction, but from many, from consistency, from presence, from the quiet reassurance that someone has been there when it mattered. And that is what made the decision so easy. Because when you believe you understand someone, when their actions have aligned with your expectations long enough, the need to question them begins to fade. And in that moment, when Carlos Reeves was faced with a choice that did not feel like a turning point, he responded the way most people would. He trusted what he thought he knew. He trusted the history that had been established. And he trusted that the outcome would reflect the same reliability he had come to expect. And for a brief period, that belief held. Nothing immediately changed. Nothing broke. Nothing suggested that anything was wrong. And that is what made it so difficult to recognize what had already been set in motion, because the consequences of that decision were not immediate. They developed quietly, shaped by factors that were not visible at the time. And as those factors began to interact with the trust he had placed in that person, the situation shifted in a way that could not be easily traced back to the moment it began. Because by the time the effects became clear, by the time the outcome revealed itself in a way that could no longer be ignored, the connection between cause and consequence was no longer simple. It had expanded into something far more complex, something that involved not just the decision itself, but everything that followed from it. And as that realization took hold, as the calm environment that once defined the situation gave way to something far more serious, Carlos Reeves was left with an understanding that could not be reversed, that the choice he made, the trust he extended without hesitation, had carried a weight he did not recognize at the time. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what follows is not just a story about trust, it is about how easily it can shape decisions in ways that feel natural in the moment, but carry consequences that are only visible later, and how those consequences can alter everything once they begin to unfold. Because sometimes the biggest mistakes don't feel like mistakes at all. Carlos Reeves had built a life that depended on structure, consistency, and the belief that the people around him were exactly who they presented themselves to be, both in his personal world and within the professional environment where reliability mattered just as much as performance. And within that balance, trust was not something he questioned often. It was something he relied on, something that allowed him to move forward without second-guessing every interaction. And that is where the central questions begin to take shape. Because understanding what happened next requires looking closely at the relationship that led to that moment. Who did Carlos Reeves trust? Who was the individual that earned a level of confidence strong enough to influence a decision without hesitation? And once that question is considered, it leads directly to another that carries even more weight. What did they do? Because the impact of trust is not defined only by the act of giving it, but by how it is used, how it is interpreted, and how it can be turned into something that produces consequences far beyond what was expected. And as those consequences begin to unfold, a third question becomes unavoidable, one that challenges not just the outcome, but the entire sequence that led to it. Could he have seen it coming? Were there signs that existed before the decision was made? Details that might have suggested a different outcome if they had been recognized? Or was the situation structured in a way that made those signs difficult to identify until it was too late? Because what follows is not immediate. It develops through a series of interactions, through moments that seem ordinary on their own, but begin to connect in ways that reveal a larger pattern. And as that pattern becomes clearer, the story shifts from a single act of trust into something more complex. Something that reflects how easily perception can be shaped by familiarity, by history, and by the assumption that past behavior will always predict future actions. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It is about how trust can influence the way we interpret everything around us, how it can narrow our focus to what feels consistent while allowing other possibilities to go unnoticed, and how, in doing so, it can lead to decisions that feel completely justified in the moment, but carry consequences that only become visible when the situation has already changed. To understand why Carlos Reeves made the decision that would eventually change everything, it is important to look at the life he had built before that moment. Because nothing about him suggested carelessness or poor judgment, he was in his late 40s, hardworking, dependable, and known by those around him as someone who valued loyalty above almost everything else, the kind of person who believed that relationships, once established, should be maintained with consistency and trust, and that belief shaped both his personal life and the professional environment he operated in, a world defined by stability, close-knit connections, and routines that rarely required him to question the intentions of others. And within that structure, there was one person who stood out, not because they demanded attention, but because they earned it gradually, through presence, through reliability, through a pattern of behavior that aligned with everything Carlos expected from someone he could depend on. This person was charismatic in a way that felt natural rather than forced, supportive in moments where support mattered, and consistently available in a way that reinforced the sense that they could be trusted without hesitation. And over time, that consistency became the foundation of a relationship that felt secure, built on shared experiences, conversations, and moments that seemed to confirm the reliability Carlos believed he understood. And that is what made the connection so strong. Because it did not rely on a single event, it was reinforced repeatedly, creating a sense of familiarity that made doubt feel unnecessary. And yet, within that familiarity, there were details that did not fully align, small inconsistencies that were easy to overlook, moments where the level of support felt slightly excessive, gestures that seemed helpful but carried a level of involvement that was not always required. And at the time, those details did not stand out as significant. They were interpreted as part of the same pattern of reliability that defined the relationship, and because of that, they did not disrupt the trust that had already been established. Instead, they blended into it, becoming part of the larger picture without drawing attention to themselves. And as this dynamic continued, the relationship reached a point where the level of trust Carlos Reeves had in this person extended beyond ordinary interaction. It became something he relied on when decisions carried weight, something he did not feel the need to question because it had been reinforced over time. And that is where the foreshadowing of what followed becomes clear, not through a single warning sign, but through a series of small moments that were interpreted within the context of trust rather than examined on their own. Because when trust is strong enough, it can reshape how those moments are understood. And it is within that reshaped perception that the most important decision was made. Because when the time came, when Carlos Reeves was faced with a situation that required him to rely on someone completely, he did not hesitate. He responded in the way that his experiences had conditioned him to respond. And then, without fully recognizing what it would lead to, Carlos Reeves trusted them with something he couldn't take back. The decision itself did not feel dramatic when Carlos Reeves made it. It felt measured, reasonable, and consistent with everything he had come to believe about the person he was relying on. Because what he chose to share was not insignificant. It was something that carried weight, whether it was financial responsibility, sensitive information, or access that required a high level of trust. And in that moment, the act of handing over that responsibility did not feel like a risk. It felt like a logical extension of the relationship that had been built over time. It felt deserved, as though the consistency and reliability he had experienced had earned this level of confidence. And for a brief period, that belief appeared to be correct. Nothing changed immediately. There were no signs that the decision had introduced a problem. The situation continued to move forward in a way that reinforced the trust he had placed in that person. and that sense of reassurance allowed Carlos to move on, without revisiting the decision, because from his perspective, it had been validated. But as time passed, small details began to shift in ways that were difficult to define at first. Responses that once came quickly started to take longer. Interactions that had been consistent became less predictable. And while these changes were subtle, they created a sense of uncertainty that did not align with the pattern he had come to expect. And at first, those irregularities were easy to explain. They could be attributed to external factors, to circumstances that did not directly challenge the trust he had established. But they did not disappear. They continued to appear in different forms, and as they accumulated, they began to form a pattern that was harder to ignore. And that is when the situation started to feel less clear, because the confidence that had defined his decision was now being replaced by questions. Not immediate doubt, but a growing awareness that something was not aligning the way it should. And as that awareness developed, the dynamic between him and the person he trusted began to shift, not openly, but in a way that introduced distance, uncertainty, and a need for clarification that had not existed before. And it was within that shifting dynamic that the turning point occurred, because at a certain moment, something happened that could not be explained within the framework of what he believed to be true, whether it was money that could not be accounted for, information that appeared in a place it should not have been, or a consequence that did not align with the outcome he expected. The situation crossed a line from uncertainty into something more defined, something that required him to confront the possibility that his initial decision had not been as secure as he believed. And in that moment, as the realization began to take hold, Carlos Reeves understood something that had not been visible before, that the trust he had placed so confidently was now connected to an outcome he could not control. And that's when he realized something wasn't right. The moment the situation shifted from uncertainty to something undeniable, Carlos Reeves found himself caught between what he believed and what he was beginning to see. Because the initial reaction was not immediate acceptance, it was confusion, a need to make sense of something that did not align with the trust he had placed so confidently. And that confusion quickly gave way to denial, not in a way that ignored reality entirely, but in a way that tried to reconcile it with the version of events he still wanted to believe, leading him to search for explanations that could preserve the trust he had built, to rationalize the inconsistencies as misunderstandings, as temporary issues that could be resolved without changing his perception of the person involved. But as those explanations failed to hold, as the details continued to point in a direction that could not be easily dismissed, the perception he once had began to shift, slowly at first, but with increasing clarity, transforming the person he trusted into someone he now had to question. And within that shift, the situation moved beyond personal doubt into a structured attempt to understand what had actually happened, prompting Carlos Reeves to begin his own investigation, revisiting every interaction, every decision, and every moment that might explain how things reached this point. And as that process unfolded, it expanded to involve others, bringing in external perspectives, and in some cases authorities, who approached the situation with a different level of objectivity, focusing on reconstructing the timeline, identifying where the inconsistencies began, and determining whether the outcome was the result of deliberate action or a series of misinterpretations. And as this broader investigation took shape, the narrative surrounding the situation began to shift publicly, framed in ways that reflected both uncertainty and suspicion, described as a betrayal case, a situation where a trusted individual was now under scrutiny. And within that narrative, multiple possibilities emerged, some suggesting that what had happened was the result of a misunderstanding, others pointing toward the involvement of a third party that might have influenced the outcome, and still others considering the possibility that coincidence had created a pattern that appeared intentional. Each explanation offering a way to understand the situation without fully confirming any single conclusion. And as these possibilities were explored, The tone of questioning directed toward Carlos Reeves became more focused, more direct, asking not just what happened, but why he made the decision he did. Why did you trust them? Did they ever give you a reason not to? Questions that forced him to confront not only the outcome, but the reasoning behind his actions, and in doing so, placed him under a different kind of pressure, one that was internal as much as it was external, because each question required him to revisit the moments where trust had been reinforced, to examine whether there had been signs he had overlooked, and as he replayed those moments, the clarity he once had began to fade, replaced by a sense of uncertainty about his own judgment, because the same interactions that once confirmed trust now appeared different when viewed through the lens of what had happened. And this process of reevaluation continued as the investigation moved forward, narrowing possibilities, eliminating certain explanations, and focusing more closely on the details that remained unresolved, until a new piece of information surfaced, a detail that had not been fully considered before, one that connected elements of the situation in a way that shifted the entire perspective. And when that detail came into focus, it did not just add to the investigation. It redefined it, because it pointed toward a conclusion that could no longer be ignored, and in doing so, it changed everything. The detail that surfaced did not exist in isolation. It connected to a broader pattern that had been present long before Carlos Reeves made his decision. And as investigators began to examine it more closely, what initially appeared to be a single act of betrayal started to reveal a structure that was far more deliberate, because the information uncovered pointed toward a pattern of manipulation, one that was not random or impulsive, but consistent and carefully maintained over time. And within that pattern, there were indications of intentional concealment, subtle adjustments, controlled interactions, and selective transparency that ensured only certain parts of the truth were visible at any given moment. And as this understanding developed, the situation shifted from a personal misjudgment into something more complex, because it suggested that what Carlos experienced was not unique. It was part of a system that extended beyond his individual case, and this is where the most significant realization began to take shape, because as the investigation expanded, it became clear that multiple people had encountered similar inconsistencies, similar moments that did not fully align, but in each case, those moments had been dismissed, overlooked, or rationalized in ways that prevented them from being connected, and in doing so, allowed the pattern to continue without interruption. And this introduced a deeper layer to the story, because it meant that Carlos Reeves was not the first to notice something that felt slightly off. He was simply the one who followed it far enough for the pattern to become visible. And as that pattern was brought into focus, the critical moment of the investigation arrived, when the evidence confirmed that the situation was not accidental. It was structured in a way that ensured it would remain hidden, not through complete secrecy, but through placement in plain view, embedded within ordinary interactions where it would not attract attention unless someone chose to examine it closely. And that is what made the discovery so significant, because it did not reveal something entirely new. It revealed something that had been present all along, something that had existed within the system without being fully recognized. And in that moment, as the full scope of what had happened became clear, Carlos Reeves understood that his experience was not defined by a single act of trust, but by his position within a pattern that had been operating long before he became part of it. And as that realization settled in, defining the emotional core of everything that followed, it became evident that he didn't discover something new. He uncovered something that was already there. By the time the full picture came into view, the outcome surrounding Carlos Reeves was no longer defined by uncertainty or speculation. The truth had been revealed in a way that left little room for interpretation, and within that truth was a confirmation that what he had experienced was not a misunderstanding or a coincidence. It was a deliberate use of trust that had been built carefully, and then redirected for a purpose he had never anticipated. And as that realization settled in, the impact of what had happened extended far beyond the initial decision. Because the consequences were not limited to a single loss, they affected multiple areas of his life. Financial stability that had been carefully maintained was disrupted, emotional certainty was replaced by doubt, and the relationship that once felt secure was reduced to something that could not be repaired in the same way. And while the situation had reached a point where it could be explained, where the sequence of events could be traced and understood, that understanding did not reverse the outcome. It did not restore what had been lost, and it did not remove the weight of the realization that the trust he had relied on had been used in a way that worked against him. And within that realization, another layer began to emerge, one that moved beyond the immediate consequences and into the question of intent. Because even as the facts became clear, the motivation behind the actions remained complex, shaped by factors that could not be reduced to a single explanation. Whether it was driven by desperation, by the need to gain something that could not be obtained otherwise, by calculated manipulation, or by a combination of these elements, the reasoning behind it did not change the outcome, but it added a dimension that made the situation more difficult to fully resolve. Because understanding why something happened does not always make it easier to accept. And as Carlos Reeves confronted that reality, the central reflection of the story became clear, not as a conclusion, but as an understanding that developed from everything he had experienced, that trust does not break in a single moment. It breaks when it is placed in a position where it can be used against the person who gave it, and that understanding carried with it a broader perspective on how trust operates in any relationship, because it highlighted how easily it can be established through consistency and familiarity, and how difficult it can be to recognize when that same consistency is being used to create an outcome that was never intended. And within that perspective is a truth that extends beyond this situation, because the hardest part is not always the betrayal itself. It is the realization that there was nothing obvious to point to beforehand, nothing that clearly indicated what was coming. And that absence of clear warning is what makes the impact so significant, because it challenges the assumption that trust can always be evaluated accurately in the moment. And as the story reaches its final point, it leaves behind a question that remains open, one that cannot be answered definitively but invites reflection. Because if you were in the same position as Carlos Reeves, faced with the same history, the same consistency, and the same absence of clear warning signs, would you have made the same decision to trust? Or would you have questioned it sooner? And after everything Carlos Reeves went through, every moment of certainty that slowly turned into doubt, every decision that once felt justified but later carried consequences he could not undo, the story does not end with him. It extends to you. Because situations like this are rarely defined by clear warnings or obvious risks, they are shaped by familiarity, by patterns that feel consistent, and by the belief that the people we trust will act within the boundaries we have come to understand. And that is where the real question begins. Because if you were in Carlos Reeves' position, standing in that same moment where nothing felt wrong, where trust had been built over time and reinforced through experience, would you have made a different decision, or would you have done exactly what he did, choosing to rely on what you believe to be true? And as you consider that, another question begins to take shape, one that goes beyond the outcome and into the nature of the situation itself. What do you think really happened here? Was this a calculated act that unfolded exactly as intended, or was it a sequence of events that developed through opportunity and circumstance? And within that uncertainty lies a deeper question that challenges how we interpret the people around us. Because how do you know who to trust? How do you distinguish between consistency that reflects genuine intent and consistency that is designed to build confidence for another purpose? Because that distinction is rarely obvious in real time, and it often only becomes clear after the outcome has already taken place. So take a moment to reflect on it and share your perspective, because every answer adds another layer to understanding how trust operates and how it can be used in ways that are not immediately visible. And if stories like this make you question the decisions you make and the people you rely on, then subscribe to Unseen Mind Lab for more stories that reveal what the mind tries to hide.